Roughly 18 miles northwest of Port Moresby, the tidal salt flats near Lea Lea in Caution Bay form a shallow expanse of thick, seasonal mud. For 34 years, this dense aquatic boundary concealed the resting place of a Lockheed P-38F Lightning. The aircraft carries the United States Army Air Force's serial number 42-12647. Archival and registry records tie the airframe to the tail number 34. A handful of secondary accounts have linked this aircraft to the name, Dottie from Brooklyn, but other surviving records explicitly report no known nickname or nose art, leaving the attribution disputed. The objective of the 1978 recovery operation was to recover as much of the assembled twin boom fighter as possible for heritage preservation, even if major sections later had to be separated for safe transport. The primary operational constraint was the physical isolation of the site, surrounded by impenetrable mud that restricted heavy equipment access. Locating an aircraft in a jungle marsh requires confirming the exact geographical coordinates before committing resources to an extraction. The Lightning rested in low-lying flats near Lea Lea, where seasonal flooding could turn firm ground into a slick, waterlogged plain. Water levels fluctuated constantly, obscuring the primary structure and complicating the preliminary site survey. The recovery team faced an environment where anaerobic mud had encapsulated the main fuselage and engine nacelles. Finding a heavy twin-engine fighter in this terrain is only the first phase of an aviation archaeology project. The physical state of the airframe dictated the entire operational timeline. Surveyors observed that the aircraft remained remarkably whole, avoiding the total fragmentation typically associated with high-energy aviation impacts. The recovery mandate required pulling the aircraft out while minimizing structural loss, choosing any necessary separations at controlled junctions rather than letting the swamp tear the airframe apart. This objective formed a hard procedural boundary. If the team applied uneven force during extraction, the resulting shear stress would destroy the historical integrity of the airframe. Leaving the Lightning in the mud was no longer a viable option due to shifting tidal flooding on the Lea Lea flats and the continuous threat of unauthorized salvage. The operation demanded precise logistical planning to navigate the roughly 18-mile gap between the Lea Lea flats and the established infrastructure of Port Moresby. Moving a large industrial object across this distance required careful planning, improvised hauling, and conservative handling to avoid tearing the structure apart on soft, unstable ground. A major challenge in swamp recovery involves assessing the unseen condition of the buried components. The visible sections of the P-38F indicated solid material integrity, but the lower structural frames were fully submerged. Without the ability to excavate the site conventionally, the recovery engineers had to rely on external visual cues to estimate the total load. The mud itself acted as a dense physical restraint. The team knew the aircraft had been trapped in this static position for 34 years. The exact resistance offered by the surrounding soil was an unknown variable that would dictate the rigging procedures. The longer the airframe remained embedded, the tighter the grip of the surrounding environment became. Every decision made during the preliminary assessment phase was constrained by the lack of solid ground. The recovery crew could not position standard heavy cranes next to the wreckage. Survey teams worked the site at low tide, picking their way across slick mud and shallow pools while mapping the exact orientation of the twin booms. They needed to identify the main spar connections and determine whether the aluminum skin had retained enough tensile strength to survive any controlled lift or haul. This mapping process was slow and methodical. The engineers cataloged visible damage and noted the sections where the natural environment had integrated with the military hardware. Any surviving markings were photographed, but the presence and exact wording of any nickname remained uncertain in the field record, leaving researchers to reconcile conflicting accounts later. Securing clear access to the wreck required cutting through vegetation while maintaining strict environmental discipline. The survey team measured the exact dimensions of the exposed structure without disturbing the surrounding mud matrix. Any sudden shift in the mud could alter the resting angle of the aircraft, placing unanticipated stress on the aluminum sections. The engineers treated the swamp as an active preservation vault. They documented every visible serial number before planning the removal strategy. This evidence collection ensured the physical record remained unbroken. The sheer size of the P-38F meant that simply digging it out by hand was impossible. The logistics required a massive mechanical intervention capable of bypassing the ground entirely. The recovery planners established a strict boundary for the operation, identifying the exact weight limits and extraction paths required to move the fighter intact. Before the heavy lift equipment could be staged, the investigators had to understand exactly what they were trying to pull from the Earth. The initial surveys suggested the airframe remained largely assembled, although the nose section had been removed years earlier. How did a heavy twin-engine fighter survive a controlled forced landing intact enough to be found largely whole 34 years later? The physical footprint of an aircraft housing two Allison V-1710 power plants dictates the structural margins during an unpowered emergency descent. In January 1944, mechanical trouble built in both engines, forcing a critical operational decision. The pilot, whose name and even the exact date remain unclear in surviving records, shut the engines down and forced the Lightning onto the tidal salt flats near Lea Lea. Bringing down a fighter that could weigh on the order of 17,500 pounds when loaded demands a controlled slide that bleeds off speed without a sudden snag and rollover. Whether the landing gear was fully retracted is not firmly documented, but the broad underside and soft, muddy surface helped the airframe stay together. This maneuver relied entirely on the specific structural architecture of the twin boom fighter. The operational constraint was to keep the wings level and allow the lowest points of the airframe to act as a friction brake against the swamp surface. The central nacelle and the lower engine radiator housings absorb the primary deceleration forces during this type of ditching. These lower structures crush and deform upon contact, bleeding off speed as they plow through the thick mud. This sacrificial load path prevents the peak impact energy from transferring into the fragile tail booms, effectively shielding the primary flight geometry from disintegration. Once the forward momentum ceased, the heavy fighter settled deep into the marsh. The immediate consequence of this forced landing was the total inundation of the lower fuselage. Mud forced its way into the wheel wells, cooling intakes, and structural voids. The two Allison engines concentrated significant mass near the center line, which helped stabilize the airframe during the initial slide. The heavy power plants acted as forward ballast, driving the lower radiator scoops deep into the sediment. Survey teams analyzing the resting state decades later noted that key mount points appeared to have held, suggesting the landing loads were carried through the center section without an immediate, catastrophic breakup. While the immediate physical damage was limited by the forced landing, a secondary environmental threat began immediately. Aluminum can corrode quickly in the presence of moisture and oxygen, and the risk rises further where salts, minerals, and dissimilar metal joints create galvanic hotspots. But in deep, waterlogged mud rich in organic material, oxygen diffusion can be severely limited, slowing some corrosion pathways even as chemistry and microbes continue to work in the dark. The result is not a magical pause button, but a different clock, one that can preserve shape and markings longer than open-air exposure would. The recovery engineers understood that the mud matrix helped the aircraft survive as a coherent object. Dense sediment could brace thin panels, support deformed sections, and pack internal spaces, holding the geometry in place. The trade-off for that partial protection was a severe mechanical penalty: mud-filled cavities and voids, adding mass and creating suction and friction that turned the airframe into a stubborn, waterlogged anchor. Every structural compartment became a dense trap for heavy, wet earth. Over time, the settling mud consolidated, creating a tight friction seal against the outer skin of the aircraft. Any attempt to interact with the wreck required calculating the exact holding force of this anaerobic boundary. The engineers mapped the intact structure to estimate how much added weight the internal sediment contributed beyond the bare airframe weight. The preserved load paths meant the airframe was whole, but the sheer mass of the waterlogged earth dictated that any future extraction would face extreme static resistance. The mud could limit oxygen exposure, but what happens to the evidence when the sealed environment is finally breached? The visible tail number 34 provided immediate historical verification upon the discovery of the airframe. Reports and later restorations have sometimes linked the displayed aircraft to the name, Dottie from Brooklyn, but the documentation is inconsistent, and the aircraft's forward section was complicated by later substitutions. What was not in doubt was the chemical shock of exposure. Once a mud-soaked aluminum structure met warm, oxygen-rich air, corrosion processes that had been slowed in burial could accelerate quickly. From late 1978 onward, and certainly through the period between 1984 and early 2002, the airframe, as displayed and later made more externally complete with added sections, sat in an open-air storage yard at the museum in Port Moresby. The institutional decision to store the massive airframe outdoors was dictated strictly by facility limitations. The museum lacked an enclosed climate-controlled hangar large enough to shield the twin boom architecture. Placing the artifact in the open yard secured it against unauthorized physical access, but exposed it completely to the harsh tropical climate. This necessary storage strategy inadvertently initiated a continuous chemical reaction. The environmental shift from an oxygen-deprived swamp to a humid surface yard triggered rapid open storage attrition. When a mud-soaked aluminum structure enters an oxygen-rich atmosphere, the retained moisture inside the airframe acts as a continuous electrolyte. The thick sediment packed inside the internal wing voids slowly dried, shrinking and cracking over time. These deep fissures allowed tropical humidity to penetrate directly into the structural core of the aircraft. Without immediate chemical stabilization, the bare metal surfaces oxidized at an accelerated rate, causing severe secondary corrosion throughout the entire fuselage. This structural degradation was not uniform across the airframe. The most critical damage occurred at the mechanical joints and attachment points, driven entirely by galvanic degradation. Aircraft manufacturing relies on multiple distinct materials, specifically pairing high-strength steel bolts with lighter aluminum skin to manage flight loads. When these dissimilar metals remain locked together in a highly humid environment, they create a localized electrochemical cell. The trapped moisture and residual swamp minerals act as a conductive bridge. The high-strength steel components survive, but the surrounding aluminum sacrifices itself, dissolving into a weak, powdery oxide. This localized corrosion specifically targeted the primary load-bearing junctions along the center section. The main spar attachments connecting the outer wings to the central nacelle suffered extreme structural compromise. The original emergency ditching had preserved the mechanical alignment, but the subsequent decades in the open yard slowly severed these critical connections on a microscopic level. The museum staff faced a severe preservation boundary. They could easily document the surface history and confirm the identity of the aircraft, but they possessed no operational method to halt the invisible internal decay. Engineers inspecting the aircraft could only evaluate the damage through non-intrusive visual inspections. The lack of specialized support cradles meant the facility could not safely disassemble the aircraft for internal chemical treatment. Any attempt to unbolt the wings or remove the massive engine cowlings risked triggering a sudden collapse of the weakened components. The conservation effort remained strictly limited to passive observation. The curators tracked the rate of material decay without the industrial tools required to arrest the active chemical breakdown. This forced inaction highlighted the sheer operational difficulty of preserving complex aerospace alloys outside of a strictly controlled atmospheric environment. The preservation team recorded the external conditions meticulously during this period. They noted the exact placement of the nose art in the factory stencils, gathering all available surface evidence before the tropical sun could degrade the remaining pigments. They established a physical perimeter around the resting airframe to monitor the increasing deflection in the tail booms. This changing geometry indicated that the internal bulkheads were actively failing under the continuous pull of gravity. The heavy engines mounted on the center section exerted constant downward pressure on the weakening spar joints. The delayed realization of this internal decay forced a re-evaluation of the overall material condition. The external evidence gathered at the site proved the exact identity of the aircraft, satisfying the initial historical objective. Yet the physical reality of the galvanic corrosion meant the airframe was slowly destroying itself from the inside out. The visual identity remained static while the structural integrity steadily collapsed. With the structure rapidly degrading, how could recovery teams safely apply the immense vertical force required to break the airframe out of the swamp in the first place? Between November 14th and November 16th, 1978, a specific geometric constraint dictated the entire extraction protocol. The fighter's 52-foot wingspan and twin boom layout made any brute drag through vegetation and mud a recipe for uncontrolled breakage. To preserve what could be preserved, As the Papua New Guinea National Museum and technical personnel working the recovery chose a controlled separation. The tail and booms were disconnected, and the aircraft was recovered in two major sections. Even with that compromise, the site fought every step. The surrounding mud allowed little purchase for heavy machinery, and every move risked turning preserved structure into fresh damage. Once freed, the two sections were hauled out and transported over 2 days to Port Moresby, aboard a low loader, trading dramatic spectacle for a method that matched the ground truth of the terrain and the limits of available access. The extraction succeeded in getting the aircraft out of the flats, but could the surviving metal support itself once the recovery phase ended? Restoring a heavy twin-boom fighter forces a strict mechanical trade-off between preserving original material and ensuring long-term static stability. By the early 2000s, the aircraft's condition and storage history pushed the story into a new phase. An agreement was made to pursue a static restoration, and major components were removed and exported to Australia under that plan. But the promised restoration for the PNG Museum did not materialize, and key pieces were not returned, leaving only a reduced center section in country. If a full static restoration is ever resumed, disassembly would require absolute precision. Mechanics would document the position of weakened frames before any cuts, label each removed section, and cross-reference measurements against original drawings to preserve factory geometry. One possible conservation approach for a heavily compromised structure is multi-airframe synthesis. Mapping a damaged load path, sourcing compatible structural segments from other wrecked airframes, stripping them to sound frames, and splicing donor ribs and fittings into the primary center section. Any such work demands careful configuration matching because incompatible production blocks can misalign bulkheads and attachment points. Before any donor spar could be approved, it would need rigorous non-destructive testing, eddy current scanning, and dye-penetrant inspection to screen for hidden fatigue and stress cracking from earlier impacts. Over the years, the displayed airframe became a composite in appearance, with added sections installed to make it look more complete. Yet the deeper story remained unresolved. In 2001, their major components were removed and exported to Australia under a proposed static restoration arrangement. Those pieces were not returned, and no completed restoration for the PNG Museum was carried out under that project. What remains in Port Moresby is not a finished, self-supporting Lightning, but a reduced center section that still carries the weight of the narrative. By September 2025, that surviving portion was moved into the new Aviation Heritage Center facility at the Papua New Guinea National Museum and Art Gallery. Any future plan to reunite missing wings and booms and to stabilize the aircraft for a true static display depends on recovering components, rebuilding agreements, and funding the long, meticulous conservation work that the metal has demanded all along.